doing the best you can in the moment, having a beer after the end of the day, getting in the car and going to the next challenge. And in those days, that was what the ALS was all about. Friendships and fresh challenges and doing your best for the moment. My name's Stephen Norrish. I'm a judge of the District Court of New South Wales. I worked as a solicitor for the Aboriginal Legal Service of New South Wales between 1975 and 1980. I went to see Peter Tobin, who was then the principal solicitor and a friend from university, and next thing you know, I was in Cowra. Well, the relationship between the Aboriginal community and the general community was not good. My observation of the local community was that they were outcasts. They weren't welcome in town. Most Kooris lived on the mission, which was called the Ramby, where I lived for part of the time I was in Cowra. The police had no relationship with the local community, although the detective there, Detective Hockey, he did try to build a relationship with young Koori fellas, not just to lock them up, but to get to know them. But the general run-of-the-mill police officer stationed in country towns had very little interest in the local Aboriginal community. They were just, as was said at the time, the fringe dwellers. And one of the things that struck me about Cowra was there were no black faces in shops, no black faces working in businesses, because local businesses, local shops, just didn't employ Aboriginal people. They were completely marginalised economically and socially. I lived in Cowra for 13 months. I lived with Les and Aggie Coe, two wonderful people, if I can be so bold to say so. Wonderful people to me, like another mother and father to me they were. Well, an average week, I'd Saturday or Sunday I could be called out to the jail at any time or to a police station. I frequently got called to go across to Dubbo, someone to be charged with a serious offence. A couple of times people charged with murder I had to go and see, or people charged with armed robberies and the like. Perhaps go up to Bathurst Jail one day over the weekend. Monday morning, for example, I'd drive to Griffith and I'd do the list at Griffith and a few defended matters. On Tuesday, having driven back to Cowra, I'd drive up to Dubbo and I'd do a day at Dubbo and I'd drive back to Cowra that night. I could drive across to Queanbeyan on the Wednesday I should say. Again, drive back to Cowra that night. Thursday I might spend in Cowra. I remember Cowra's court day was Thursday. And Friday I might go across to Condobolin and then come back to Cowra. So I'm not saying that happened every week. There were variations of that, but it was very rare for me to be in Cowra for the day unless there was a court day. When I got hired, the only country offices were Nowra, Grafton, Brewarrina, Cowra, and then after I was hired, John Terry was hired to go to Wilcannia. Now my area at Cowra covered north to Dubbo. I had Dubbo as part of my bailiwick, although sometimes Martin Sides would come down from Brewarrina to Dubbo. I went as far south as the Victorian border. I went as far east as Queanbeyan, and I went as far west as Griffith or Balranald. My office was my car. I had 2 or 3 favourite CLRs sitting on the back shelf of the car that got very yellowed and twisted from the effect of the sun over many years. So one thing I forgot to mention, when Peter Tobin hired me, effectively Peter hired me, although the board approved my appointment, Peter told me firstly that if I lasted a year, from the American experience of similar organisations, that'd be good, but if I lasted 2 years, that'd be exceptional. Now, a lot of people have worked much longer than I. The current principal solicitor, John McKenzie's a veteran going back over 30 years, but I did last 5 continuous years, so I did pretty well. And the other thing was he offered me a brand new car. Peter had apparently had troubles with his motor vehicle up at Brewarrina with no air conditioning. Well, each of the solicitors in the 5 or 6 country offices got brand new 302 square inch V8 engined yellow Fords, the latest Ford. They were called the Sharks, the yellow Sharks, and they had air conditioning. But when the air conditioning was on, they did about 6 miles to the gallon, so they weren't particularly economical. The principal field officer at Cowra was Les Coe, Paul Coe's father and Aggie's husband. Aggie was the office manager. There were two younger field officers. There was Billy Craigie, who's no longer with us, and Lyle Munro, who was going out with Jenny Coe. She's now Jenny Munro. She was living in Cowra, and Lyle came down to live in Cowra from Moree, and occasionally Lyle was my field officer, and the relationship was very close. We'd spend nights together away from town. The most important thing that field officers did for me was to introduce me to the various communities, who are all very different, and make me feel welcome within the community and enable the community to feel comfortable with me. I once was driving back from Broken Hill. It was 3 a.m, and I'd hit 2 kangaroos. That's without a shadow of a lie. Between Wilcannia and Cobar, and between Cobar and Nyngan, I hit a kangaroo on each of those parts of the trip, pushing the rhubarb back onto the bonnet at one stage. And about 3 a.m. in the morning, I got to a town called Nevertire, which is on the road between Nyngan and Dubbo, and I tired at Nevertire. I pulled over the side of the road, and I had to sleep for a couple of hours, and then kept going on to where I think I was going to Parks Court, actually, without a shower. Yeah, there was a lot of driving and playing music and singing to yourself and taking in the beauty of the countryside. It was quite metaphysical in parts, you know. I had to watch it was like watching a sort of a film, Antonini film, as you were driving along, watching the sunrise or set, as the case may be. But it was pretty lonely too, being on the road. But people were always hospitable. You could pull into Wilcannia and pull into someone's driveway, and people would give you a meal, and made a lot of friendships that way. I came out of the anti-Vietnam, anti-conscription movement in a sense. I came from a working class family who would be described largely as Labor Party supporters with very little knowledge of Aboriginal people. I'd grown up in Wagga Wagga, but knew very few Aboriginal people, and I'd come back to Sydney at the age of 13 and went to a state high school in the St George area. But at university I got involved in going to anti-war demonstrations, anti-conscription demonstrations, and of course that was a period of time that Paul was down in Sydney, starting at University of New South Wales, and the tent embassy, I think, was in 1971. The parallel with the protests against the war was the development of other mass movements, including movements relating to land rights and the rights of Aboriginal people, and those movements intermingled a great deal, and that had a tremendous influence on me. So when I got to the point where I met Peter Hidden and I was doing work as an article clerk for the ALS, I was really interested in trying to do something in relation to Aboriginal people, which corresponded, of course, with the burgeoning civil rights movement in the United States. Now, that probably had a bigger influence on the minds of people like Gary Williams and Paul Coe and those leaders, Bob Belair, because they were the victims of the racism that I'd never even experienced until I started working for the ALS and realised what racism really was. All those things sort of came together at that time, you know, 1972, 73, 74, 75. That's why the ALS in part was created, I guess. It was, in a sense, a mass movement, if I could use that expression, or an aspect of the mass movement driven by Aboriginal people to assert themselves and to have their rights protected. But the legal services are limited. They're only part of the picture, you know. I mean, I suppose the best thing a lawyer can do for his client is to get him or her acquitted. But the next best thing you can do is get the most lenient penalty that can be obtained. But the capacity of a legal service to change a person's social circumstances is almost non-existent, even in the context of acknowledging that the legal service may have a role in law reform and in other social reform. There needs to be a lot more than a legal service to change the environment that causes people to go back to jail. By the time I was employed in 75, the board of directors were all Kooris or Murris. And the administration, if I could put it that way, was run by Aboriginal people. But then by the time I became principal solicitor in, I think, 1978, WALS had formed in 1977, so Dubbo to Broken Hill, Brewarrina were now run by a separate organisation. We had some connection with them. There was the South Coast Aboriginal Legal Service down in Nowra, so we weren't responsible for those areas. We were responsible for the rest of the state. So the total number of ALS solicitors across the state may have been as many as 20. I'd never met John Terry after he'd gone to Wilcannia until I went to Lake Cargelligo to do a case, or the list, and I had to pick up John Terry in West Wylam because he'd come down from Wilcannia. And on that day when we went to Wilcannia, Lesco came with me as my field officer. Tombo Winters, who was the office manager, field officer in Brewarrina, he came down from Bree with some defendants, and William Bates came down from Wilcannia with some people from Wilcannia, and there was after we'd been in court, there was John Terry, me, William Bates, the late Tombo Winters, the late Lesco, and a few of the local Koories. We had a game of pool and a beer, and we all shook hands, and we got in our cars, and we disappeared. Tombo went north to Brewarrina, William Bates went west to Wilcannia, and I went off to Cowra, and with a cloud of dust, we just disappeared in 3 different directions, going, to our inevitable fate. And when I went away, when I reflected upon that, that seemed to represent to me all that the ALS was about. Of just being in the moment, doing the best you can in the moment, having a beer after the end of the day, getting in the car and going to the next challenge. And in those days, that was what the ALS was all about: friendships and fresh challenges and doing your best for the moment.